Hi, everyone. My name's Ken Fogel, and I'm here to introduce our next speaker here at the J Champions Conference, now in its fifth year. Right now, we have Loyanne Groner, who's going to be talking about best practices to secure web applications. Have a great session. Don't forget to ask questions in the comments, and Loyanne will be happy to answer them during the session. Great. Have fun.
Thanks, Ken. Hey, everybody. Welcome and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So today I would like to share with you a little bit some lessons learned about how to secure APIs. And let's get started. So first things first, why this is an important topic is whenever we are developing APIs, we get the ticket, especially if you're working in an agile environment. So you get your ticket, you work on the API. Hopefully you're writing the test cases to support that code that you are writing. And then usually you're just going to push this to a development environment that's going to get tested as well. And then maybe you have, a user acceptance testing environment, and then it's going to get pushed to production. In some companies, when you are pushing the code into a QA or into a UAT environment, you can request for the API to get tested as well by a security team or by an ethical hack team. And they will test it. They will provide a report, and then you read the report, see if there are any vulnerabilities that are found, and you'll fix it. And then you push it again and you repeat the process. But this process is a little bit slow because you're working on something, and then once you have it completed, you consider your ticket done, you push it to testing, and then you have to work on the security fixes. Or this can be even worse. Sometimes the company will only do the testing once the API is in production. And then when you have moved to another backlog item, you have to stop what you're doing and then do the security fixes. Or it can be even worse. There's no security testing at all, and then you have vulnerable APIs in production. So this is a very expensive process. One, if you have moved to the next ticket, you have to stop it and you have to fix it. And all this life cycle, again, is very expensive. So ideally, what we'd like to do is to have all the security culture from day one, because this is much more for everybody and also is way less expensive for the company as well. So, hi, my name is Loyani. I work as a director of engineering at BNY. I'm also a published author and a Java champion. So today I would like to share with you some of the lessons learned that I've learned along the way in my career. And a few of the things that I'm going to show you today, I am guilty of doing those, but hopefully I have learned by working with the security team, getting the API tested, and I've added that to my lessons learned. And now whenever we develop APIs, we take that into consideration. But one thing that is very important as well is that some of the things that we're going to talk about here today might be very basic for you. However, we're still failing the basics. So it's very important that we get this right. We make the security as part of our foundation. With a solid foundation, we can move on to more advanced items. So let's get into it. First things first, what is API security whenever we are talking about web security, API security? So if you will do a quick search, especially with Java security, you're going to find a lot about authentication and authorization. This is indeed actually the first step whenever we are doing, securing our APIs. However, securing APIs go way above beyond this, which we're going to touch base here today as well. But first, let's start with the basics and let's see a way that we can do better authorization for our APIs. So for this scenario, suppose that we are working with an e-learning platform where we have our records, which are courses, and we have, teachers, educators, and we also have students as users of our platform. So I'll show you a few very simple code snippets so we can see how we can do better authorization. And again, I have to admit that I am guilty of doing some of these things in the past. Just make it clear, in the past. First things first, I think it is a very common thing that whenever we developers are working on something, meaning writing a regular expression or even working with a role-based authorization, we usually tend to write what we are not allowed to do, right? So for instance, in this example, we have a very simple method just to update a course record. We are receiving the ID. We have the course as well from the body where we're trying to update. We get the authenticator user. But since we're trying to update the course, it means that a student should not be able to update this record. So we check, okay, if the user is a student, then we cannot update. So this is very common to see out there. However, there is a better way of doing that because this is not the best practice. What will be the best practice here is to deny by default. What does this mean? So again, we have the exact same code snippet. However, we're not checking if the user is a student. We're checking who can update this record. So if we're talking about an e-learning platform, we're gonna check if the teacher or educator or if the admin of the system. So these roles should be allowed to update this record. So this is a much better way. And this means that we're working with the famous reback or role-based access control. If you're working with Spring Security in Java, Spring Security is beautiful and is great because it allows us to use annotations that we can easily provide who are authorized to actually execute the code that we have within that particular method, or in the case, in the controller as well. So again, if we're trying to update the course, even if you're trying to simplify that code snippet that we just saw, we can say that an admin or a teacher are able to update a record. This is great, but we can run into another different problem. If you're working with small systems, this works perfectly. But however, as our systems grow or with time, when we receive requests for new requirements, new functionalities that we have to add to the system, maybe we also need to add new entitlements, new roles into the system. And then we can end up with something that is called a role exposure. So I've started with an admin and a teacher, and maybe I have somebody to assist that educator, a teaching assistant. And maybe if our platform is growing, something like Udemy or even like YouTube education, we're going to have an account manager that is also able to assist the educator with updating that particular record. And again, from true roles, that was fine. We end up with 4 or more. But I don't know about you. Whenever I'm searching for trying to educate myself and trying to learn more about Spring Security or even with Java security, the majority of the material that I see out there is, okay, how do we add Spring Security to an application? I see an admin and I see a user. I don't know about you, but throughout my almost 20 years of career, I have worked with systems that are a little bit more complicated. It can be with multiple roles, but usually it looks something like this, where the entitlement, the role access, is actually sometimes down to the method that we have within the controller. And you can have this mapped in a spreadsheet just for your education purposes, but usually this is going to be persisted into a configuration or into a database. So how can we use Java and, for example, Spring, if you're using Spring framework, to actually map this out so we don't end up with that role exposure and we don't end up with something that is very complicated to maintain later? We can decouple the logic and create a custom security expression. So for example, in Spring, you can create this has privilege method. You can set the privileges, and this set of privileges you can have, for example, in a table in a database or wherever else you like to keep that information. And we work with a granted authority. So whenever we are checking if a particular user has access to execute certain permissions within the application, we can get that information directly from the source and check if that particular person has that privilege. So how does that look like when in the code when we have in the method? So let's go back to that update method. And now we can still use the add pre-authorized annotation, but now instead of has is admin or is a teacher or teaching assistant or even an account manager, now we can check if that person has a course update privilege. Again, maybe to create a course, it's going to look a little bit different. But in this case, now we can use that mapping, that matrix with the mapping to actually check if the person has the privilege. And this is really good because if your project, your application is growing and you're adding more functionalities, you're adding more roles as well, it's much easier to maintain this. And again, in case you do have to add another role or you do have to add another mapping, you don't actually need to change your source code for that. Everything will happen a little bit more dynamically. So no more hard coding. Okay. Now, we have this, but we still might run into another issue. So we have created our mapping with the roles, whoever can access and execute that particular action within our system. But this particular pre-authorized, it's only checking if the user has access to perform this particular action. But if I know the ID of the course, and again, this can be we're using like numbers here just to make it simple, but it can be a UI ID as well. But if I know the unique identifier for that particular record, and I know exactly what my API is expecting, should anybody be able to update the record? Again, if you're thinking about something on the lines of like Udemy, where you have different educator, different courses, I should only be able to update my information, like my course is the one that I'm teaching. And maybe you have a different course on the platform as well. So I should not be able to update your information. And this is where a lot of mistakes happen whenever we are working with APIs as well. So again, we're going to use the approach of deny by default. How does that work? And again, this issue, it's called the broken object level authorization. And it is also added to the top 10 of the OWASP issues that is published every 3-4 years. So this is indeed one of the top issues that we have within APIs, not only in Java, but all the languages in general. So again, let's go back to this update example. I'm getting the course information, the object from the request body. So the information is coming from the request. And I check if the user is authenticated. It's authenticated. That's good. It means that the user is able to execute the logic that we have within this method, but we're getting the data from the request. So if I check if I'm able to update this particular record from the information from the request, in some cases it might be fine, but there are many tools that we can use to intercept that information past something that is not completely true. And if you are trusting the request, you might be allowing something that should not happen in the first place. So let's check how we can improve this. Again, lesson number 1, never trust a request. Always go to the source of truth and check if that particular user is able to update that record. Yes, I know it might add a few milliseconds to your processing, but this is well worth it because we are securing our API. In this case, we know the unique identifier, so we're going to go to the database, for this particular example, which is the source of truth. We're going to get that information from the database, and with the information that we have in the system, we will check if that particular user can update this record. And again, if the person is not able to update it, we don't have permission. So this is a much secure way of doing this. Okay, we've gone through a better authorization. So I do hope that you take this into consideration the next time that you have to add, authorization into your API, and also check if that particular person is able to update that particular record. But we can also run into a few other issues, and this is also one of those top 10 issues that we have in the OS list, which is called the property level issue. What exactly is that? Again, let's go into a very simple example. We have a user class representing the user in our system, and we have just two properties just so we can keep it simple. We have a username and we have a password. The password here is a little bit of a red flag. So suppose you have an API that's returning the user information like in a JSON format. And I have my user class over here, so I'm just going to use the JSON ignore annotation. And this is going to tell, for example, Spring Framework that we should not add that whenever we are persisting that information in a JSON format. So Jackson mapping is going to take care of that for us just by adding the annotation, which is very, very useful. However, now let's say that a new developer joins the team, or you are responsible of adding the social security number or the tax ID or an information that is private that should not be shared at any cost. And for this particular day that you're coding this, you forget to add annotation and you go through all the code reviews. Nobody also noticed this, and this gets approved and this code gets pushed to production. This is a very, very big problem. So how we can improve this and avoid this just by forgetting to add the annotation, for example. A very simple solution for this is creating DTOs, data transfer objects. We usually create a DTO for the request and the response, so we are not actually exposing the entity, the model object that we're using within our APIs. So we can create a user DTO. Even better, if you're using modern Java, you can create a record so you don't have to handle all the boilerplate code that usually comes when we are creating classes. So another point for modern Java. So we create a user DTO with only the information that we are allowed to expose. This way, there is no accidents, and we're not exposing the password, we're not exposing the social security number or the tax ID of that particular user, and we have a little bit more control. For this particular case, when we call the get my info method, we are just simply creating the record and we are manually setting. But if you're dealing with an object, of course, that has many properties, and if you have many records and many DTOs in your project, you can also use a mapper library just so you don't have to do this manually. Again, it's all about the balance and see if it is worth it or not. Now, the other question that might arise, and I've been into a few different discussions about this as well, is do we need a DTO for the request and the response? In some companies, you're going to have some metrics around duplication of code, and then some teams will prefer not to create a DTO for the request and response. If you can, it is always better to have a request and response. But if you are reusing the DTO for both request and response, just be careful for REST APIs where we are receiving the ID or the unique identifier, for example, in the path variable. So you do not reuse the ID that's inside the DTO. Again, this is only if you are reusing. As a best practice, and whenever possible, always create a DTO for a request and response. Yes, I do know that it's going to give you a little bit more maintenance on this whenever you have to add or remove properties from that DTO. But again, this is a very worthy cost, in my humble opinion. Now, since we've talked about not exposing any property level, right, there's always the password and key exposure in our properties or YAML files as well. So let's take a look at one example, and I've seen this happen as well in some of the code that I've seen throughout my career in working in different companies. Again, whenever you have a local setup, you might have a development database if you're not working with like a Docker image locally, and if you have a dev database that's shared by everybody, and then you're going to set what's the URL to access the database. You're also going to set the username and the password. So you have like the company dev or the name of your project, like My Learning Platform Dev. And then for QA, you're going to have My Learning Platform QA. And it's very easy to guess that, for example, for production, it might be My Learning Platform Prod or something like that. And same thing for passwords as well. And although it might not seem so serious, this vulnerability here where we have a dev environment password hard coded in our configuration files, for reasons like this, where you can easily guess what's going to be the password and what's going to be the URL to access an upper environment, even a production environment, this can become very serious as well. So one good practice here is to always prefer to use a vault solution, especially if you are in a corporate environment, like something like CyberArk or HashiCorp. So there is no way that the password can be exposed as well. And you can also use some sort of configuration for that. So be always careful with that. And remember, if you are just getting started in a new project, never hard code the password, because that is considered a security vulnerability by many scanner tools that we have out there in the market. The other thing as well that we as Java developers, especially if you're working with Hibernate, we are guilty of is we're creating a project and then we have that particular property, the spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto, and we set that for update, because we do not want to create the table manually, and then we want to use the power that we have with Hibernate and JPA and let the framework to create the table for us with the exact information that we have added to our Java class. This is okay for a dev environment or even sometimes for a local environment, but we have to be very, very careful with this, because again, if we have a DDL access, it means that you can create table as you can create table. You can also drop a table, and depending on the access, you can drop the entire database. So this is a serious exposure and can be something that is very serious in case it get exposed and leak, and then somebody with a malicious intent is able to do that to your application. So the rule of thumb is, whenever you are using, again, a username and a password to connect to a database from the application, do not use a username that has access to create, drop, and alter tables. Just something that is, read, write, maybe execute a store procedure, views, triggers, and something like that. Just do an analysis, see what's right for your application, and avoid that at all costs. If you have to, do have a separate process where you are creating, you are also committing the SQL scripts that are needed. And again, there are many different ways of doing that. We have, for example, Liquid-Base that's available on the market, or you can even create your own pipeline just for the database changes as well. So the application itself is not responsible for doing that. So just be careful with that. Now, let's talk about the next topic, and this is one of my favorite, because again, I've been guilty of doing this in the past as well, and especially nowadays, I still see many developers, doesn't matter if it's a junior developer or a senior developer, to still forget to do input validation, especially on the controller level on the applications. And this is something that is very basic, and it's very easy to fix as well. So first things first, if you are working with an API that is feeding a front end, so you have your UI and then you have your API, you have your front end, doesn't matter what you use in the front end, and then in this case it's Angular, just for the sake of the example. And you have a very beautiful front end that is fully validated. So the front end is able to showcase, and display all the error messages to the users. So users have a very quick feedback on what they have to fix before they can click on that save button again and submit the data to the API. But when we stop and then we look at the API code, there's nothing. Here we have, where's the data validation for creation, for update, for all the methods that we need in our REST API. We are simply getting the data from the request, accessing the request body, and we're just sending that to the service, and the service is simply persisting that information into the database with absolutely no validation. And this happens very, very, very often. And again, what did we learn when we were talking about a better authorization? Is we never trust the request. We never trust the input here. Even if you're using like Postman or something to test your API, you send something, and again, look at the stack trace. We're gonna get like org Spring Framework data integration violation exception. This, just for this exception here that we are exposing in our application, this is a security vulnerability itself. Because if something that has malicious intent towards our application is able to detect what is the technology that we're using behind, what is the technology stack, this person can try to explore different ways. And maybe if there is, for example, a Spring Framework CVE out there, that person can try to explore that and then try to breach your application as well. So again, never trust the input. And let's talk a little bit about as well how we can improve this stack trace here, this error message here. But let's go back to the input validation part. Again, remember, even if you are a full stack developer and you are the person that's working on the front end and on the back end, you have your validations on the front end just to provide the user that quick feedback so that the user can fix whatever data they're trying to submit to the API. So always add the same validations that you have on the front end in your API as well. In fact, I would go a little bit further, because your API is the one that needs to have all the validations. So we have a very secure application. The validations that we have on the front end, they are nice, but that's for a user experience, usability experience for the user. The API is the one that needs to be secure. So always add. And again, you can use the Jakarta Beans validation. It's a great library. So always add that to your project. And Hibernate validators as well. It's another dependency that you can add, which enhances the Jakarta Beans validation and allows you to add a few more annotations too. So again, for that course, let's make sure that's not blank, that's not null, that we have a length. We are also checking for the range. We are enforcing limits as well. If you have like enumerators, enums, you can also add validations for those, but make sure that we have that. I would add that to your DTO, and I would add that to your entity, to your model as well, because especially if you're using Hibernate and JPA, they already do one validation even before it can go to the database. And again, try to keep that in sync with your database script. Or sometimes if you have a little bit more room in your database, but you're keeping your property a little bit shorter, just to adapt that to according to the business logic that you need to implement. So again, don't forget to validate the type, the length, the format, the range, and enforce all the limits that are needed. Because look at this. This is beautiful when we have all this validation and make sure that we are validating the input accordingly. The other thing is, don't forget to validate the strings. We always forget about the poor strings, and we just leave it like open over there, open. So I'll give you one example. Let's say that we are creating a course, or what if we are, a user or a person's name? Is that a valid name? So I have exclamation point, at, hash, the $sign, percentage. So is that a valid name? And again, we're going to go back to what we discussed in the beginning as well. Deny by default. What we have usually, what we usually do whenever, okay, so a name, I have to validate a name. And again, I'm guilty of doing this because I've done this in the past. So if I had to create a regex for a name, I would just look down to my keyboard. I would just press the shift key, and I would just get that exclamation at, and just add all those what we call like the special characters in my regex to not allow that. However, if we look at the Unicode characters, there's so many more characters than that. And again, take that into consideration as well. The audience of the application. If you're working with an application that is only for the US or Canada, then you can set a few characters. If you're adding like Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, then you have another set of characters that should be allowed. If you're working with European names or Irish names, so it's another set of names. If you're working with like company names, legal names, then there are a few other set of characters that should be allowed. But work with your product team, working with a business analyst to see what is actually allowed instead of not allowed. Yeah, name validation is indeed really hard to do. Again, prefer the allowed list. So again, we are denying by default anything that we don't need. The other thing that sometimes we might also forget, especially if we're working with pagination, is we are setting the page, we're setting the page size, the limit of records that we can retrieve on the back end. But again, if you're working with a data grid in your front end, you might have pagination, you might have a drop down to select how many records the user would like to see per page at the same time. And again, the front end is fully validated. The front end display a nice drop down so the user can select how many records they would like to see. And then our API, the page size doesn't have any kind of validation. And I can select 1, 10, a million, 10 million. I can redo like a select from the entire database and display, and that can lead into a lot of issues. So don't forget to add the limits, the range as well in your controller parameter, so you're not exposing data that you're not supposed to. And again, if you have strings as your parameters, do not forget to either sanitize it. So it's another way of doing that as well. You can do like, even through an interceptor, you can clean up, or you can return an error message to the user saying that there are invalid characters and the user should review it, or you can remove those automatically and only save depending on the business logic that you need to application, or even use a regular expression to just showcase that nice validation message back to the user as well. But don't forget to validate your input, regardless if it is in DTOs or if you are in the controllers. Again, as I mentioned, if you have like your entity objects, your model objects, it's also nice to add that, because Hibernate and JPA, if you're using Hibernate and JPA, they do have some validations before it goes to the database. And this is also important since we are touching on that, because especially if you're working in a cloud environment where the number of requests or reads and writes that you are doing to a particular database, this is how we get charged. If your API has all the validations, we are avoiding unnecessary calls to the database as well, and that can bring down your cloud bill a little bit as well. The other issue that we have too is SQL injection. This is not new. I think this is something that, at least the developers will go through this once in the lifetime in their careers. And again, whenever we're working in the company environment, we might have legacy applications that were written a long time ago, and maybe they did not follow the best practices that are considered best practices today, or maybe the developers did not know, or maybe the API did not support that particular functionality back then. So we might still see some SQL injections, or maybe because you don't know, you are creating your queries manually, you are concatenating, including the parameters that are coming from the request, which is even worse, that can lead to SQL injection too. So again, especially if you have dynamic SQL, always prefer to use like a prepare statement just to avoid that. In Java, it doesn't matter if you're working with JDBC, or if you're working with Hibernate JPA, you can do this in a secure way. So do not forget that, and avoid at all costs to have those dynamic queries where you are manually concatenating the parameters as well. So always use like a prepare statement as a preferred way. Now, there's more, because whenever we are creating APIs, we're talking here about input, but there's another type of input as well that we might run into. And this is a very common functionality to have with our APIs, which is file upload. And file uploads might seem simple, but these are things that can really give us headaches. So first things first, as a best practice, let's always set limit upload limits, download limits to our API. Again, this can lead performance issues depending on the type of application. Do not leave this blank. If you're working with a Spring framework, this is a very simple 2-line configuration that you can use. You can add to your properties file or to your YAML file. What's the maximum file size that we can upload, and what's the max request size that we can download as well. Again, work with your product owner, work with your business analyst to find out what makes sense to your business. You might add just a little bit of buffer just to be safe. Test it out as well, and again, find out what's needed and what makes sense to the application that you're working with. The other thing regarding file upload, where it can be really tricky, is make sure that you are validating the extension and you are validating the type of the file as well. You can use validate the file name length as well, so you're not getting a very long file name. And again, we never trust the request. Let's repeat, we never trust the request. So don't trust the content type header, because that can be altered as well if you use those kind of like interceptor tools, and it can lead to incorrect data. The best way of doing this is always checking the file's metadata directly. So one of the very common issues that we can run into is the path traversal vulnerability, especially if you're working with a like a NAS drive that is Unix based, the path. Again, validate the file name. What if the file name gets updated to something that's really gonna mess up your operating system? So be very careful with that. And again, remember that what we talked about, the username and password for the database. Also use a functional idea here as well if you're working with some kind of like a NAS drive or a storage solution that doesn't have too many permissions. Again, deny by default. There are 2 libraries that I really like and that really have saved me in fixing vulnerabilities very quickly when it comes to file download. The first one is the Apache Commons IO, where you can normalize the file name, so we avoid that path traversal vulnerability. It's a simple file name you choose, normalize. Again, you're gonna get a clean file name out of it that you can use. If you need to go a little bit further, if you need something that is a little bit more advanced, we also have Apache Tika. that we can use, where we can actually check the file metadata, get the correct file extension, and then run our validations. This is very important because especially if you're working, I'll just give one example. If you have an API where you are expecting an Excel spreadsheet, and then you are getting like a text file, or you're getting a Word or PDF file, it's much easier to just send the denial of that just because the file extension doesn't match, and then you can actually validate the file to make sure that it's following the predefined template in case you do have one. So when it comes to the file content, besides these two things that I just mentioned, also scan for viruses. You can use an antivirus like an API, or again, depending on the infrastructure that your application is in. Just make sure that you're always scanning the files that are being uploaded before you check the contents of the file. Depending on the business needs of the application or the company that you work at, it might not be allowed to have Excel spreadsheets with macros and formulas, just from a security standpoint. If that's allowed, that's fine. And also sometimes embedded objects in Word documents and PDFs should not be allowed. But again, just work with your business analyst or your product owner to confirm what makes sense and what should be allowed or not for the application that you're working with. Okay, we covered input validation so far, but I've mentioned that stack trace, right? That whenever if we don't validate the input, we can expose that stack trace. So let's go back again to that. Again, if we have a malicious actor, and if this malicious actor knows the stack trace that we're using in a project, it can use any kind of known vulnerabilities that are still open and has still not been fixed within our project to try to breach and expose unnecessary data in our application or cause any kind of harm or damage. So one very simple fix that we have, especially if you're working with Spring, you might notice that I love working with Spring because all my tips here are for Spring developers. In Spring, we have one very simple property and configuration that we can add, which is the include stack trace never in the error messages that are being exposed. And then you get something that is a little bit more generic. However, stack traces are very important to us because this is how we're going to be troubleshooting any kind of issues that we might have in production that we didn't, catch during the development. So always log the stack trace, but do not expose the stack trace in your API. Just return a generic yet meaningful information. So whoever is reading that can still try to figure out what went wrong and log the stack trace. So you have that information in hand whenever we need to do any kind of troubleshooting. Also, be careful with what you are logging. As developers, we also have an ethical responsibility. So don't log passwords, authentication credentials. Do not log personally identifiable information. Don't log like social security, tax IDs, anything that can be personally identifiable information, which is any combination of first name, last name, and something else, like first name, last name, email. This is personally identifiable information. We have several regulations across the globe. There is the GDPR for European users. There is the California Privacy Act. Brazil also has one. So many countries and many different states are adopting their own data privacy. And it is important that our systems are also complying with all these different regulations, like financial information, account number. In some places, account number is something that is private and it should not be shared. So don't log that kind of information. Health, medical information, any kind of confidential business data, any kind of legal compliance data, personal communications, biometric data. But then you might be asking yourself, what can I log, or how should I handle this in case I do need to access this kind of information for any kind of troubleshooting? So let's take a look at a few possible approaches and some best practices. First thing, again, be careful with the toString. Remove any kind of sensitive data from toString, especially if you're working with any kind of sensitive and confidential information. Make sure you are manually removing it. You you're not passing this responsibility to a third party, especially for the folks, for example, that are using like Lombok and it's logging everything. Make sure that you are removing this. Again, be careful when you are using annotations, because you might be forgetting when you're adding another confidential information. In this case, I prefer to be a little bit more careful and manually overwrite the to string, so I can add only the data that is that's needed. And in case you need to log something that's going to be useful and meaningful whenever you have to troubleshoot. Again, credit card number, don't log this, because this is confidential information. Instead, what you can do, just get something that is a unique identifier that you can go back to a database and then check for the information, or use some kind of token or even a vault so you can retrieve that information securely in case you do have to troubleshoot. And the other important thing is also for rate limit for APIs. Sometimes we do forget this. Again, there are many flavors available on the market. You can use Spring AOP for very simple solutions. There's also the bucket for J for rate limit in case you still need something simple but don't want to use Spring AOP. You can use Redis. Again, there are many tools available on the market that you can check what makes more sense for your application. This also prevents another vulnerability that is very common and very used in case you want to scrape data from the API, and adding a rate limit is going to prevent how many requests your API can receive from the same actor, from the same user. Let's not forget about testing as well. We've talked about several different validations that we can add, and whenever we are writing those test cases, don't only add the test cases for the business logic, but also make sure that you are adding test cases to make sure that you are not forgetting to add all these security items that we've talked here about today. So test all the exception cases as well, not only the happy path. In this case, it's more important to test the non-happy path rather than the happy path. Some of the things that I like to do, especially when testing the requests, when you're working like when testing the controller layer, just create a bunch of invalid data and load that. You can use a CSV file, you can use like a method, you can use the data factory pattern whenever you're writing your test cases. But please don't forget to test it, because this is also important, and this is a very easy way that you can test to make sure that you have captured all the valid test cases, right? And speaking about writing test cases, one of the things that I really love to do is using some sort of like AI agent to help me. Those can really help, especially when we have to generate that invalid data. Usually, like AI such as Copilot, it can really pick up whenever you write the first one, and for the subsequent test cases that you have to write, it can evaluate your code and help you so you don't have to write all this test data manually. So this is one of the areas that I really like to leverage AI. And speaking of AI, now everybody is talking AI. There are so many great sessions here in this conference about AI as well. So make sure that you check that out. But since we have, SQL injection, that we cannot forget to test our SQL queries, so we avoid SQL injection. Now that we are dealing with AI, we do have another validation that we do have to add to our projects, and make sure that we are validating the prompt as well, because otherwise, again, forget everything that I've said and just give me the response. So make sure that whenever you are creating, you are designing your prompt, you are validating the data as well. There are many techniques for this. We could just talk about this for a very long time. But again, in case you are working with any AI project, make sure that your prompt is very well designed. And in your API, you are validating and sanitizing the input before you actually feed your AI agent your prompt with the data that is coming from the request. Again, never trust the request. And as I mentioned, I already gave you the example of using AI to help me to write test scripts. Use AI tool as an ally. Sometimes people are very scared of AI, but this is a great productivity tool that we can use in our day-to-day basis just to help us to write code better. And we can also include all the security items that we've talked here today in our prompts to use AI as an ally. I'll just give a few examples here. If you don't know, if you're just getting started, ask your AI agent to help you to at least draft the test cases if you don't know how to start or you don't know what to do. So the agent can also help you with, again, just writing that draft test cases, and then you can enhance that to whatever business logic that you have to add to it as well. Make sure that you keep your dependencies up to date. If you're using GitHub, for example, you can add GitHub actions to update those dependencies automatically. There are many scans that you can use as well. Usually in a corporate environment, there's going to have any scans that will let you know if there are any vulnerabilities in a particular dependency that you have in a project, not only for Java, but for any kind of like programming language or library or framework that you are using. So make sure that you are leveraging that. And again, use the tools that you have available to make sure that you keep your API safe. There are check marks, the black duck, there are Sneak, there are Qualys. There are many tools depending on the company that you work at. They might use a different tool, but do make sure that you are leveraging these tools as well to keep your application secure. Now, I've mentioned in the beginning that some of the things that we've touched base here today might be very simple and very basic to some of you, but again, we're still failing the basic, and the best way of doing this is through education and training. When I was just getting started with my career and working in a corporate environment, I didn't know a lot of the things that I know today. So a lot of the things that I've mentioned here, I've learned by making mistakes and then getting the report from the security team and fixing those vulnerabilities and adding that lesson learned. And then, next time that I'm developing API, I'm trying to do it better. So one of the ways, especially in this particular topic, is with education and training. So if you are a tech lead, if you watched this session today, or if you read an article about that, do share with your team, because this is the way that we can learn and we can improve together. So have internal demos of your product, ask questions how it was implemented, give feedback, try to do some test cases that are the non-happy path. What happens if I'm using the pagination? If I try to test the API using Postman, I use 1 million instead of 100 records. What that will happen? So we can work, with your QA team and with your development team to try to test the application and make it better. Make sure that the security requirements are part of the user story. I think that by now we are very used in getting the ticket with the requirements and the test cases that are already part of the definition of done. And we also need to make sure that security requirements are also part of the definition of done. It should not something that we're going to take care later. It should be part of day one. So again, security is not a technical debt. It's something that is very important and should be a priority for every organization. And again, prioritize the vulnerabilities that are often found within your project. Make sure that that's part of the backlog and that gets prioritized as well for every sprint in case you're working in an agile environment. I do have a security checklist for code reviews. I do believe that code reviews can be something that is very powerful if you use it like the right way, not to judge somebody else's code. But you can use code reviews, for example, just to make sure that before we are pushing something to production, that we have in fact taken care of all the security items. Again, making sure that are all the endpoints authenticated and authorized? can the user modify the data? Is the right user allowed to modify the data? Is the input validated or sanitized? Are we doing the validation from the data source instead of the request? In case we do have file uploads, are we validating the file uploads? In case we are handling confidential data, nothing is getting exposed in logs or toStrings or in our back to our response from the API. The error handling is also not exposing the confidential data. We're also not exposing the stack trace. So again, you can use this as a base. You can add more things as well. Let us know in the comments in case you use something else for your checklist. But again, just start simple and then go from there, always improving little by little. So I would like to thank everybody that watched this session today. I hope you have learned something new. And I think we might have a few minutes for questions in the comments. Let us know, and I'll try to answer as many as I can if the time permits. Thank you so much. Let me go back to the comments. I think just going through the comments and making sure if we have anything. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks for all the comments. A lot of great advice in the comments as well. Thank you for participating, and thank you for adding and improving the topics that we discussed today. I'm talking on mute. So Marco here has one question. Validating at every level isn't a validation of dry. For example, if I check input at a web service level, I'm enough sure that repository will not get validated data. Yes, you are correct. You might not need it. I think it really depends on the team that you work with and the organization as well. If you're working, for example, in a microservices architecture, there is a very small chance of that particular entity or model getting reused somewhere else. But sometimes when you're working in a monolithic environment, one entity or one service might be used in several different places. So for those particular cases, might be good and might be wise to add the validation at different layers, even if you are duplicating and repeating yourself. But again, I think it really depends on your team, the application that you're working with, and the organization. Again, these are just some guidelines, but you do have to evaluate case by case and check what makes sense for you or not. I hope I have answered your question.
Marco, you could just indicate in the comments if you have more questions for Loen, and yeah, and if any other person has a question. I think we have a question in the comment section, Loen.
I see another question from Bruno Lima. The ideal will perhaps be to always create a DTO for data input and another for data output. Again, this is something that some people might not agree with. In my opinion, if you can, do create one DTO for the request and another one for the response, one for the input, one for the output. Because one, depending on the case, the data might be a little bit different. Not all the properties that you have in a DTO might be needed in the request and the response. If they are exactly the same, if you are using your request DTO for example, for an update, as one of the examples that I showed here today, and if you are reusing the DTO, make sure you are not getting the ID from the DTO itself, but get from the path of your REST API. Just make sure you're not doing those things, but whenever you can, please do create a different DTO for request and response, just to be on the safe side. Another question from Leonardo here: should security keys be stored as environment variables? What are the alternatives? That really depends on the environment that you're in. In some companies, you might be using like a vault solution, such as like HashiCorp, CyberArk. In this case, you have some sort of like a key or a user ID, and you use the tool, you retrieve the password. You don't even know what's the password. You don't have to store the password. The only place that's going to get stored, it is in the vault. And again, if you have a simpler environment, you might be passing that as an environment variable as well. Again, different applications, different environments, different solutions. But the only thing that I would not recommend is to hard code that, because that is definitely a violation and a security issue.
Yeah. Thanks, Lowen. I think we'll probably have more questions. Just checking the comment section.
In case anyone has questions as well, I think this video is getting the session is getting recorded. You can leave in the comment section as well, and I'll try to check within the next few weeks and try to reply in the comment section as well, in case you do. Or you can also get in touch with me, LinkedIn or Instagram, probably LinkedIn, and I'll try to answer you.
We have a question, Lowen. We have a question in the comment section. Where do we store security keys?
Yes, that was the question from Leonardo that I answered. If you can use a vault like HashiCorp, CyberArk, or any other solution, if your company is using that. But if not, sometimes there is I believe if you're using like a public cloud environment, there is some sort of configuration that you can use as well, so you're not hard coding that into your application.
Okay. So Marco made a comment, said, I used to do double checks. There's a comment from Marco there.
Yes, the double checks. I used to do double checks when working on a monolithic because at a certain level could be handled just with a check. At a lower level, raise an exception. Yes, again, different scenarios might require different solutions, but as long as you are checking, doesn't matter if you're double checking, make sure that we are validating and adding those checks so our APIs are secure.
There's a comment from Muhabo. It's not in English, so
it's in Portuguese. Thank you for the comment. Thank you all for the comments and for participating today.
Yeah, thank you, Lowen. It was a very insightful session. I believe that a lot of people would have learned a lot across like simple security checklists, front-end validation, Apache Tika. You said a lot about exception handling and logging, prompt engineering. I'm sure the audience would have learned a lot from this session. And like you said, I think the session is being recorded, and they can actually get a video to make reference. And if you have any questions too, you can always reach out to Loan. Loan, I believe Loan has, she's active on LinkedIn and she has a Twitter account. You can always reach out to Loan if you have any questions.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.